Operation Barbarossa was the largest invasion in human history, but newly declassified documents from 2025 show the German defeat was already sealed long before June 1941, not only because of the huge distances or Soviet manpower, but because Germany's logistics model, built for rapid strikes in small European states, failed almost at once when confronted with the scale of the Soviet Union. The shortages of fuel, equipment, and transport were permanent limitations, not temporary setbacks. Even basic obstacles like incompatible rail gauges or the mud seasons of Russia slowed every advance. What seemed like a campaign of unstoppable conquest was instead rooted in fragility from its first steps. And while German planners struggled with these realities, Europe itself was already shifting under the weight of uneasy agreements that promised stability, but only disguised approaching war. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact's false calm. On August 23, 1939, Europe's governments were stunned when two states that had defined themselves as sworn enemies, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, announced a treaty of non-aggression. Newspapers carried the photographs of foreign ministers Molotov and Ribbentrop signing documents in Moscow, but the public display revealed only part of the truth. For years, both regimes had denounced one another as existential threats. Berlin cast Bolshevism as a racial and ideological poison, while Moscow depicted fascism as the spearhead of capitalist oppression. Just days before, few would have believed that Stalin and Hitler could appear aligned. Yet the pact not only bound them to refrain from attacking each other, it also included a framework of cooperation that gave each side immediate tactical advantages. What looked like an impossibility in August 1939 quickly redefined the balance of power across the continent. The treaty was accompanied by a secret protocol that reallocated eastern Poland and the Baltic territories into German and Soviet spheres of control. This confidential understanding enabled both armies to act in concert less than 2 weeks later, Wehrmacht forces pushing in from the west and Soviet troops advancing from the east. The partition of Poland followed swiftly, making clear that the pact was as much about territorial opportunism as it was about neutrality. The same arrangements confirmed that the Baltic states and segments of Romania were also to fall under Soviet sway, while Germany consolidated its hold in central Poland. The division of these lands, carried out without the consent of their inhabitants, became one of the defining demonstrations of the cynicism behind the agreement. The consequences extended beyond maps. Stalin considered the deal a form of insurance, an attempt to buy time. Still recovering from purges that had stripped his officer corps of experience and coherence, and facing industrial reorganization still underway, the Soviet leader was wary of direct conflict with Germany too soon. Intelligence estimates reaching Moscow suggested that Hitler remained focused on defeating Britain and France and would avoid the dangers of a two-front war. For Stalin, this encouraged the belief that signing with Berlin might postpone confrontation and give him space to rebuild. Factories and defense industries could be relocated eastward, out of range of bombers, while the Red Army replenished its ranks. In Stalin's view, the pact promised a breathing period in which his regime would be better positioned for the war he believed inevitable. For Hitler, the benefits were of a different order. The immediate advantage was that Germany could invade Poland without fear of Soviet resistance, ensuring that London and Paris would be the primary opponents in 1939. Just as crucial, the pact unlocked the flow of Soviet raw materials at a moment when Germany faced pressure from British blockades. Thousands of tons of foodstuffs, oil ores, and other commodities traveled west while German forces stormed through Poland and later swept across France. The Soviet economy, in effect, underwrote Hitler's campaigns of 1939 and 1940. Archives reveal that by the time German planners were drawing up timetables for an invasion of the USSR in mid-1940, deliveries of Soviet oil, grain, and metals were still crossing the frontier. One arm of the relationship was already preparing to break the pact, even as the other continued fulfilling its obligations. This duality shaped the entire arrangement. Each dictator assumed they had outmaneuvered the other. Stalin bet that Germany would not risk betrayal until the Red Army had reconstituted its strength. Hitler believed that a temporary understanding with Moscow eliminated his eastern danger long enough to secure victory in the West. Newly available Politburo records show that Stalin received multiple warnings of growing German hostility from autumn 1940 onward. But he assessed the risk differently from later wartime hindsight. He judged that the treaty gave him critical months to stockpile arms, reorganize formations, and transfer production east into the Urals. He underestimated how far Hitler was willing to gamble on open conflict, but his policy reflected calculation rather than naive trust. The partition of Poland highlighted the uneasy nature of this arrangement more clearly than any document could. Soviet and German officers literally encountered each other in the captured cities, parading in joint photographs while concealing profound suspicion. To both populations, the gestures of harmony rang hollow. In German propaganda, Bolshevism remained a mortal threat. In Soviet propaganda, friendship with Berlin was celebrated in public but privately regarded with unease. Neither side expected peace to endure. Both prepared in silence for a confrontation that would be more massive than anything Europe had yet endured. Diplomats abroad toasted the pact as a sign of stability, and newspapers in the Axis and Soviet press hailed it as proof of rational diplomacy. Yet beneath the surface, it marked only a suspension, not a resolution, of conflict. German officers drafted operational studies assuming that the Red Army could be caught unprepared, while Soviet staff reorganized defensive positions under the assumption that Hitler had every reason to avoid premature betrayal. Each leadership told itself that it controlled the calendar, and each underestimated how much the other was willing to risk. By transforming the early phases of the war into a contest fueled in part by Soviet resources, the pact only guaranteed that a later clash would escalate beyond precedent. By June 1941, the illusion collapsed. German formations crossed the very borders that had been redrawn in 1939, and Stalin's calculation that the pact offered durable protection evaporated. The territories that had served as a buffer under the secret protocol became staging grounds for Wehrmacht drives toward Minsk, Kiev, and Smolensk. What Stalin had conceived as breathing space became a liability. Populations annexed under the pact were suddenly exposed as the front lines of an invasion. For Hitler, the earlier alliance now proved useful not as diplomacy, but as preparation. The resources transferred from the Soviet Union had sustained Germany up to the moment of betrayal. Looking back, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was neither a triumph of strategy nor a path to security. It was a temporary convenience that lulled both men into believing they had solved the problem of timing. Stalin measured it in terms of months gained. Hitler measured it in terms of supplies and space to maneuver. For the millions who found themselves subject to the secret protocol's divisions, it meant dispossession and uncertainty. And the illusion of calm it projected encouraged both leaders to take risks that set the stage for an unprecedented conflict. The invasion that followed would test not only ideology and military strength, but also the practical ability of Germany to sustain such a war. As the first armored units surged into Soviet territory, a paradox began to reveal itself. The very state that had enjoyed Soviet oil, grain, and minerals in the years leading up to Barbarossa now depended on a supply system that was never designed for the vastness of its new campaign. This tension between ambition and capacity soon emerged as one of the decisive factors shaping the course of the war. Planning for a war Germany couldn't supply. It remains one of the central paradoxes of the German invasion in 1941. The Wehrmacht prepared for the most extensive land campaign in history using a logistical model never intended for such a scale. Their supply system had been designed for compact, short-lived drives across Belgium, the Netherlands, or France, countries with dense transport networks and rail gauges already compatible with German standards. Moving divisions in those environments meant short supply lines, where trucks could deliver rations and ammunition directly from depots to the front within a day. The Eastern Theater, however, stretched across thousands of kilometers of sparsely developed land, much of it with different infrastructure altogether. German officers understood these realities in broad terms, but entered the campaign planning as if sheer speed and aggression would erase such limitations. In truth, the campaign's sustainability was compromised from the very outset because preparations assumed a war too short for logistical strain to matter. Once the advance carried deep into the Soviet Union, those misplaced assumptions gave way to accumulating shortages that proved impossible to recover from. The entire plan hinged on Blitzkrieg tactics, a swift, decisive strike meant to bring the Red Army to collapse within weeks. The concept had worked in France, where the Wehrmacht's armored groups reached the Channel coast in mere days. In Russia, that same approach meant traversing over 1,000 kilometers simply to close on Moscow. Yet the planning cycle continued to operate on the model of Western campaigns. Supply branches were assured the fighting would last no more than 3 months. Deliveries of spare parts, fuel reserves, and winter clothing were not pressed as urgent because leaders assumed that by autumn, the Soviet Union would be forced to capitulate. What looked like optimism in 1940 and 1941 later revealed itself as negligence. The transportation systems and reserves required for deeper operations had not been organized, and the moment German columns rolled eastward, every additional mile magnified the stress. Once the invasion began, the mismatch grew undeniable. Armored spearheads surged across the frontier, but the units responsible for feeding them trailed far behind. German records from the supply branch show that by the third week of the operation, fuel requests went unanswered or were fulfilled days late. Formations halted not because of Soviet resistance, but because the last canisters of gasoline had been emptied. Trucks drove for hundreds of kilometers over rough, unpaved routes, breaking down in vast numbers. Even at the start, Germany did not enter the campaign as a fully motorized army. While Nazi propaganda celebrated mechanized columns, in practice the Wehrmacht relied heavily on motor transport, but still used hundreds of thousands of horses in 1941. These animals pulled roughly 2/3 of supply wagons, hauling ammunition, water, and barrels of fuel. Exhaustion among the horses accumulated quickly in the heat of summer, creating another vulnerability. The supposed mobility of German divisions was in reality chained to living creatures unable to withstand such demands. Railways could have offset the burden, but there too the assumptions collapsed. Soviet tracks were built on a broader gauge, which meant German trains could not use them until engineers physically dismantled and rebuilt the lines. The conversion process lagged far behind the army's speed. As armored groups pressed forward, they outdistanced the usable railheads by hundreds of kilometers. Supplies piled up west of the frontier because the new lines remained incomplete. By August 1941, spearhead units had advanced so far beyond their logistical base that basic rations and spare parts moved at a crawl. Infantry formations fell back on requisitioning food from civilians, stripping towns and villages for grain, while workshops dismantled wrecked vehicles to scavenge usable components. The practical results quickly filtered down to the men on the line. Soldiers began recording shortages long before the onset of winter. In diaries, they described going hungry in midsummer when regular rations failed to arrive. Ammunition had to be counted out bullet by bullet in firefights, as commanders held back reserves for future engagements. Newly released quartermaster reports show that within weeks of the campaign's start, officers were warning Berlin that the army was living from exhaustion. Truck strength dropped by nearly 40% in the first 4 months. Fuel losses during transport, through breakdowns, evaporation in leaky barrels, or seizure by partisan attacks, reached levels so significant that operational orders became detached from what could actually be done. The paradox of battlefield success worsening the supply crisis appeared almost immediately. Panzer groups achieved great encirclements, trapping hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. Yet within their captured territory, German formations lacked sufficient food even to provision themselves, let alone their prisoners. Officers reported situations where guards and captives alike were starving as supply convoys failed to arrive. What looked like triumph on an operational map in practice created more mouths to feed and more strain on convoys already overloaded. In the east, distance itself was often the deadliest opponent. Every kilometer taken meant another kilometer that wagons, trucks, and rail crews had to cover, with capacity that never matched demand. Nor did the much-anticipated resources of conquered regions provide relief. German planners had assumed that occupied Soviet farmland would feed their armies. Instead, systematic scorched-earth tactics destroyed harvests before invaders could seize them. Villagers concealed supplies or had abandoned them altogether. In some areas, German officers found more ashes than grain. Local requisition thus produced meager results, and the Wehrmacht sank deeper into dependence on overstretched convoys. The outcome was a self-defeating cycle. The more territory gained, the longer the supply tail grew, and the less effective the occupation became. It is important to emphasize that these issues were not temporary problems to be corrected with more time. They reflected structural contradictions. The German economy could not produce enough trucks to replace the tens of thousands destroyed or abandoned. Rail reconstruction never kept up with the velocity of the advance. Fuel demand grew beyond what the available transport system could deliver. These shortages did not disappear with better planning. They remained constant throughout the campaign and into 1942. The invasion had been built as though the army would never need to operate far from its starting lines. When that prediction failed, there was no fallback plan. The German commanders themselves were aware of the contradictions. Reports from the field often paired descriptions of celebrated battles with blunt admissions that fuel, ammunition, and food were running out. Victories that captured Soviet armies came paired with requests for thousands of replacement trucks or for fuel that never arrived. The entire design of the attack assumed the size of France or Belgium, but thrust itself into a territory several times larger. What unfolded was a relentless exposure of the fact that Germany had mobilized men and weapons for a short, decisive war, while omitting the logistical backbone that might sustain a long one. By the end of 1941, this flaw was impossible to ignore. The advance had stalled outside major Soviet cities not only because of resistance, but because German schedules, depots, and stockpiles had collapsed under demands never met. In that sense, the supply system was not simply failing. Its limitations set the boundaries of what the German army could hope to achieve. Where materiel did not flow, victory could not be consolidated. The invasion carried the likelihood of eventual failure within it, because its foundations never matched the territory it sought to dominate. This left Germany in a position of severe contradiction, an army still capable of destroying opponents in set battles, but unable to convert those triumphs into lasting strategic control. Its own infrastructure, its reliance on animal power in a mechanized age, and its misplaced assumptions condemned it to an unwinnable contest. And while this weak link shaped the operational rhythm from the first weeks, an even broader misjudgment haunted the German leadership, the belief that their adversary was too weak to withstand such pressure. That perception, rooted in recent conflicts and ideological arrogance, proved as decisive as the supply failures that undermined every plan. Myth of a weak Soviet Union. The German leadership entered 1941 convinced that the Soviet Union was fragile. Their judgment rested heavily on what they had seen during the Soviet-Finnish Winter War of 1939–40. Soviet divisions that had looked disorganized, supply failures frequent, and casualties severe. Hitler and his planners concluded that the Red Army might be vast in numbers, but hollow in effectiveness. They believed the Soviet state survived only by force and propaganda, and that once German armies seized its major cities, the structure would collapse altogether. This was less an assessment of reality than a reflection of ideological bias, and it shaped the entire invasion plan. The reality was more complex. The Winter War's poor showing came at the height of Stalin's purges, when much of the officer corps had been removed and new commanders thrust into roles they were unprepared for. Soviet weaknesses in Finland showed the cost of that disruption, not the permanent state of the Red Army. By 1940, reforms were already in motion to rebuild command structures, reorganize formations, and modernize equipment. The Soviet government knew Germany posed the main threat, and preparations were underway even before Operation Barbarossa began. Key factories were dismantled and relocated hundreds of kilometers east to the Ural Mountains, where they were out of reach of German aircraft. This relocation of industry, vast in scope and carried out with precision planning, ensured that production not only survived the invasion, but eventually expanded. The Soviet leadership demanded enormous sacrifices to make this mobilization possible. Factories disassembled brick by brick were reassembled in the Urals or Siberia. Workers, technicians, and their families traveled with the machinery, setting up entire industrial towns overnight. Women and teenagers took up factory jobs in huge numbers, while older workers endured punishing hours to keep production running. Families lived in makeshift housing near industrial complexes so that every resource went directly into sustaining output. Instead of collapsing under the invasion, Soviet industry moved, adapted, and hardened against attack. The relocation was one of history's most ambitious logistical undertakings, and it gave the Soviet system a foundation far stronger than German planners had imagined. The results became clear by 1942. Soviet industry, initially disrupted, quickly rebounded. Tank production surged, centered on the T-34, a model that proved decisive. Its design combined durability, sloped armor, and mobility while being simple to mass produce. Where German factories produced high-performance vehicles in relatively small numbers, Soviet plants turned out T-34s in the tens of thousands. This single vehicle became a symbol of Soviet resilience and technological competence, shocking German officers when it appeared on the battlefield only months into the invasion. By the following year, Soviet armor production had surpassed Germany's by a wide margin, ensuring that battlefield losses could routinely be replaced. Artillery and aircraft followed the same pattern. Relocated factories in the Volga and Ural regions produced enormous volumes of guns, mortars, and shells. Soviet doctrine emphasized concentrated artillery bombardments, which became more feasible as production climbed. Aircraft production also exceeded expectations. By late 1942, the Soviet Union was rolling aircraft off its production lines faster than the Luftwaffe could replace losses. German reliance on complex designs caused bottlenecks, while Soviet designs emphasized efficiency and scale. War reports show that Soviet squadrons could absorb devastating raids, yet field replacements within weeks. This capacity to replenish, rooted in industrial relocation and mobilized labor, overturned the assumption that Soviet resources would exhaust themselves within months. The reality on the ground reflected these shifts. German intelligence reports written in the autumn of 1941 already expressed surprise at the sheer number of Soviet replacements appearing on the front lines. Tank losses suffered at Smolensk or Kiev were offset by reinforcements that arrived in alarming numbers. German aircraft units destroyed hundreds of Soviet fighters on the ground, only to encounter fresh squadrons weeks later. The expectation that Soviet material losses would cripple resistance proved entirely false. Each month, the Red Army stabilized its lines with new equipment drawn from factories that had been reconstituted far east of the fighting. Lend-Lease aid from the United States and Britain added another layer of resilience. Imports of trucks, jeeps, and aircraft lightened the burden on Soviet factories, allowing them to concentrate on tanks, artillery, and small arms. By shifting transport production to outside suppliers, Soviet industry could channel more resources into heavy weapons. The arrival of hundreds of thousands of Western-built vehicles helped mechanize Red Army divisions and improve mobility. But the foundation of Soviet recovery was still domestic. Relocated factories, mobilized labor, and strict central planning that ensured material reached the front lines. The German assumption that Soviet inefficiency meant wasted resources proved deadly wrong. In practice, central committees oversaw industrial relocation with meticulous coordination. Rail deliveries kept materials moving, New mines in the Urals and Central Asia supplied metals and fuel, and evacuated populations provided a vast workforce. By 1943, Soviet production dwarfed German capacity. Stalin's system, for all its brutality, had created conditions in which the state could absorb staggering losses while increasing military strength. The early months of disaster had forged the mechanisms of recovery, and the Red Army that emerged in 1942 bore little resemblance to the army humiliated in Finland. The irony is that German aggression itself accelerated Soviet mobilization.